Marshal Thomas Garrett stood at the edge of Pine Ridge, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming Territory. At 43, his weathered face bore the lines of countless difficult decisions, each one etched deeper than the last. The silver badge on his chest felt heavier today than it had in his 15 years of service. Word had come from Washington. New settlements were planned for the sacred hunting grounds of the Lakota, and it was his job to ensure the transition went smoothly. The bitter wind carried the scent of sage and impending change. Thomas adjusted his worn leather coat and spat into the dust. He'd seen enough broken promises to know this wouldn't end well for anyone involved. Before we dive deeper into this story of conscience and conflict on the frontier, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments which state you're watching from. Your support helps bring more authentic Western tales to life. His deputy, Jimmy Morrison, approached on horseback, his young face tight with concern. Marshal, Chief Running Bear requests a meeting, says it's urgent. The 25-year-old had only been wearing a badge for 2 years, but he'd already learned to read the signs of trouble brewing. Thomas nodded grimly. I figured as much. The railroad surveyors were spotted near Medicine Rock yesterday. He mounted his horse, a sturdy bay named Ranger, who'd carried him through more confrontations than he cared to count. Jimmy, what do you know about the Fort Laramie Treaty? Signed in 51, guaranteed the tribes their hunting grounds in perpetuity. Jimmy replied, guiding his horse alongside Thomas's as they rode toward the Lakota camp. Perpetuity's a fancy word for until we change our minds, Thomas said bitterly. He'd been present at those negotiations 9 years ago, a younger man who still believed in the honor of his government's word. The memory of Chief Running Bear's trusting handshake haunted him still. The ride to the Lakota village took them through rolling hills dotted with buffalo grass and wildflowers. Thomas remembered when herds of buffalo had thundered across these very plains, their numbers so vast they darkened the horizon. Now, scattered bones bleached white in the sun served as grim reminders of how quickly things could change. As they crested a hill, the Lakota camp came into view. Dozens of tipis arranged in careful circles, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing while their mothers worked on hides. It was a picture of peaceful existence that Thomas knew was about to be shattered. Chief Running Bear emerged from his lodge as they approached. At 58, the chief carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd fought hard for his people's survival. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, fixed on Thomas with a mixture of respect and wariness. Marshal Garrett, Running Bear, said in carefully practiced English, his voice carrying the weight of years. You come with troubled spirits today. Thomas dismounted and removed his hat, a gesture of respect he'd learned long ago. Chief, I wish I brought better news. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. New orders from Washington. They want to establish 3 settlements in the valley beyond Medicine Rock. Running Bear's expression didn't change, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around his eyes. The sacred valley where our ancestors rest, where the spirits of the buffalo still run. I know what that land means to your people, Thomas said quietly. I've argued against this decision, but you wear their badge, Running Bear interrupted. Not unkindly, but with resigned understanding. You are caught between 2 worlds, friend Thomas. Like the wolf who runs with men but dreams of the pack. The comparison stung because of its accuracy. Thomas had spent years building trust with the local tribes, learning their customs, respecting their ways. He'd married a half-Cheyenne woman, Sarah, who'd opened his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered. But Sarah had died of fever 3 winters ago, taking with her the bridge between his 2 worlds. The railroad company promises compensation, Thomas offered weakly. Running Bear's weathered face creased into a sad smile. Can they pay for the tears of our grandmothers? Can their money restore the sacred sites where we pray to the Great Spirit? He gestured toward the valley. That land holds the bones of 7 generations of my people. It is not for sale. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Thomas could see the young man beginning to understand the complexity of their situation. This wasn't about law and order. This was about survival, culture, and the clash of 2 vastly different ways of life. "How long do we have?" Running Bear asked. 60 days, Thomas replied. "The first surveyor teams arrive in 2 months. Running." Bear nodded slowly. "Then we must speak with the tribal council. Perhaps there is another way." He looked directly at Thomas. "Will you stand with us when the time comes, Marshal? Or will your badge prove heavier than your heart?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. Every compromise, every justified betrayal, every time he'd chosen duty over conscience. As he looked into Running Bear's eyes, he saw not just a chief defending his people, but a mirror reflecting his own moral struggle. The tribal council meeting took place that evening, under a canopy of stars that seemed to press down with unusual intensity. Thomas sat beside the sacred fire, its orange flames casting dancing shadows across the faces of 12 tribal elders. Each man bore the marks of a life lived close to the land, sun-weathered skin, eyes that had seen too much change, hands that remembered when the buffalo herd stretched to the horizon. Running Bear spoke first in Lakota, his voice carrying across the circle with the cadence of ancient ritual. Thomas understood enough to catch the essence. The white man's government wanted their sacred valley, the same government that had promised them peace 9 years ago at Fort Laramie. Old Crow Feather, the eldest among them at nearly 70. Winters rose slowly. His English was broken but clear. "I remember when the Iron Horse first came. They said it would bring prosperity. Instead, it brought soldiers and settlers who took our children to their schools and taught them to forget their names." Thomas felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. He'd seen those government schools, witnessed children torn from their families and forbidden to speak their native tongues. Progress, they called it. Civilization. "What does the Marshal propose?" asked White Eagle, a warrior in his 40s whose scars spoke of battles with both men and nature. Thomas stood slowly, feeling every pair of eyes upon him. "The territorial governor insists this is legal under the new congressional mandate, but I've read the fine print. They have 60 days to complete the surveys. If the land is deemed unsuitable for development during that period, the project gets shelved indefinitely." A murmur ran through the council. Running Bear leaned forward. "What makes land unsuitable?" "Geological instability, dangerous wildlife, extreme weather conditions," Thomas listed. "The surveyors need to complete their work safely to file their reports." White Eagle's eyes narrowed. "You suggest we make their work ... difficult?" "I suggest you exercise your treaty rights to observe and document their activities," Thomas replied. "Carefully. The Fort Laramie Treaty grants you access to traditional hunting grounds. If large groups of your people happen to be conducting ceremonies in that valley during the survey period, well, that's your legal right." The elders exchanged glances. Crow Feather chuckled, a dry sound like wind through autumn leaves. "The Marshal speaks with a forked tongue, but it points toward wisdom." Running Bear studied Thomas intently. "This plan of yours, it risks much. If your superiors discover you are helping us ... then they'll discover what I should have realized years ago." Thomas said, his voice steady. "Some things matter more than a badge." The council deliberated late into the night while Thomas waited outside Running Bear's lodge. Jimmy had returned to town, but not before expressing his own doubts about the developing situation. "Marshal, this feels like we're walking a tightrope." "Over a canyon," the young deputy had said. What if the army gets involved? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Thomas had replied, though privately he shared Jimmy's concerns. Colonel Harrison at Fort Mitchell was known for his harsh methods and his belief that the only good Indian was a subdued Indian. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper on the night wind, reminding him of conversations they'd had about justice versus law. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. She'd told him once after he'd wrestled with a decision about a white rancher who'd been stealing Cheyenne horses. A good man knows the difference. When the council fire finally died to embers, Running Bear emerged. We have decided. The valley will be occupied by our people for spiritual ceremonies during the survey period. But Marshal, you must understand, if this fails, we will not go quietly to a reservation. Too many of our people have died on those barren lands. Thomas nodded grimly. He'd seen the conditions on the reservations: overcrowding, inadequate, food supplies, disease, and despair. It was a slow death sentence disguised as government policy. There's something else you should know, Thomas said. I've heard rumors about a railroad company hiring private security. Mercenaries, not soldiers. Men who don't follow military protocols. Running Bear's expression darkened. What kind of men? The kind who shoot first and ask questions later. Thomas met his eyes. The kind who see profit in every dead Indian because it means less resistance to their railroad. The next morning, Thomas rode back to Pine Ridge with a heavy heart and a clear mission. He needed to gather intelligence about the railroad company's plans and find ways to delay the survey legally. But first, he had to deal with an unexpected visitor waiting in his office. Marcus Wellington sat behind Thomas's own desk, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as an outsider even before he opened his mouth. The man's pale complexion and soft hands spoke of boardrooms and bank vaults, not frontier hardship. Marshal Garrett, Wellington said, not bothering to rise. I represent the Colorado and Pacific Railroad Company. I trust you received word about our upcoming survey operations? Thomas hung his hat on its peg and studied the intruder. I did. I also know you're sitting in my chair without invitation. Wellington smiled coldly. My apologies. Force of habit. I'm accustomed to taking charge of situations that require delicate handling. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the town's dusty main street. I understand you've built relationships with the local savages. The casual slur hit Thomas like a physical blow. If you're referring to the Lakota Nation, yes. I've worked to maintain peace in this territory for 15 years. Peace is expensive, Marshal. Our investors prefer more permanent solutions. Wellington turned back to face him. We're prepared to offer you a bonus of $500 to ensure our surveyors encounter no ... complications. Thomas felt his hand instinctively move toward his gun. And if I refuse? Then we'll request a new marshal from the territorial governor, one more amenable to progress. Wellington's smile never wavered. The choice is yours, of course. But consider carefully. Your replacement might not share your humanitarian concerns. As Wellington left, Thomas realized the battle lines had been drawn more clearly than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the soul of the frontier itself. 2 weeks later, Thomas found himself caught between increasingly desperate circumstances. The railroad surveyors had arrived earlier than expected, accompanied by 12 hired guns who made no attempt to hide their contempt for local law enforcement. Their leader, a scarred man named Jake Morrison, had made it clear that Marshal Garrett's authority ended where railroad interests began. Thomas stood on the porch of his office, watching the surveyor convoy roll through Pine Ridge's main street. The townspeople gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. Some showed excitement about potential economic opportunities, while others worried about the inevitable conflict with their Lakota neighbors. Dr. Amanda Cross, approached from her medical practice across the street. At 38, she was one of the few women in Pine Ridge who commanded universal respect, having delivered half the babies in town and treated everyone from cowboys to tribal members without discrimination. "Thomas, I've been hearing troubling rumors," she said, adjusting her medical bag. Some of the survey team were asking about local Indian movements, wanting to know about burial grounds and ceremonial sites. Thomas frowned. "That information isn't part of any legitimate survey work." "That's what I thought." Amanda glanced toward the saloon where several railroad men had taken up residence. "There's something else. I treated a Lakota woman yesterday. Star Maiden, Running Bear's niece. She said warriors from other tribes have been arriving at their camp. Cheyenne, Arapaho, even some Crow." The implications sent a chill through Thomas. If multiple tribes were gathering, it meant they viewed this as more than a local dispute. It was becoming a symbol of broader resistance to encroachment on tribal lands. Jimmy Morrison emerged from the telegraph office, his face pale. "Marshal, we've got problems. Message from Fort Mitchell. Colonel Harrison is sending 2 companies of cavalry to maintain order during development activities." Thomas felt the walls closing in. Federal troops would change everything, turning a civil matter into a potential military confrontation. "When do they arrive?" 3 days, Jimmy replied. "And there's more. Governor Patterson wants a full report on your cooperation with railroad interests." That evening, Thomas met secretly with Running Bear at a secluded canyon 5 miles from town. The chief brought White Eagle and 2 other warriors, while Thomas came alone, a gesture of trust that wasn't lost on either party. "The soldiers come," Running Bear said without preamble. "We have 3 days to decide our path." Thomas nodded grimly. "Once the army arrives, my options become limited. Colonel Harrison doesn't negotiate, he gives orders." White Eagle spoke. Up, his voice tight with controlled anger. "My scouts report the survey teams are deliberately desecrating sacred sites. They knocked down prayer wheels at Medicine Rock and used an ancestral burial marker as a surveying point." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Such desecration wasn't accidental. It was calculated provocation, designed to force the Lakota into violent resistance that would justify harsh military response. "There's more you should know," Thomas said heavily. "The railroad company isn't just interested in your valley. I've seen the full territorial maps. They want a corridor that stretches from Medicine Rock to the Powder River. That's the heart of traditional Lakota territory." Running Bear closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, Thomas saw the weight of impossible decisions. If we fight, our children die. If we submit, our spirit dies. "Tell me, Marshal, is there a third choice?" Thomas had been wrestling with that same question for days. "Maybe, but it would require trust from your people and courage from mine." He outlined his plan carefully. The key was timing and legal maneuvering. If they could document the railroad company's deliberate provocations and present evidence of treaty violations to federal authorities, they might force investigation that would delay the project indefinitely. "I need photographs of the desecrated sites," Thomas explained. "Written testimony from tribal witnesses. Evidence that the railroad company is deliberately provoking conflict." White Eagle looked skeptical. "And you believe the white man's courts will listen to Indian testimony?" "Not alone," Thomas admitted. "But there are people in Washington who still honor treaties. Senator Miller from Colorado has been critical of railroad excesses. If we can document clear violations." "It's a gamble," Running Bear said quietly, "but perhaps our only chance that doesn't end in blood." They agreed to begin documentation immediately. Thomas would use his authority to investigate reports of vandalism, while tribal members gathered evidence and testimony as they prepared to leave. Running Bear placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. My friend, you know that helping use may cost you everything. Your badge, your home, perhaps your life if the railroad men discover your true loyalty. Thomas looked up at the stars, thinking of Sarah and the conversations they'd had about moral courage. Chief, I lost everything that mattered 3 years ago. The badge is just metal. The home is just wood and nails. But a man's honor, that's something you can't replace once it's gone. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Jake Morrison and 3 of his men had ridden out to the Sacred Valley, ostensibly to provide security for the surveyors. But Thomas's own reconnaissance revealed they were systematically destroying every spiritual site they could find. Dr. Cross arrived at his office with Star Maiden, Running Bear's niece, who'd been beaten while trying to protect a medicine wheel from destruction. The young woman's injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. More importantly, she'd witnessed the entire incident. They laughed, Star Maiden said in halting English, tears streaming down her bruised face. The bearded one said, "Let's see. Your spirits protect this." Then he smashed the sacred stones with a sledgehammer. Thomas felt rage building in his chest. This wasn't development. It was systematic cultural destruction designed to break tribal resistance through spiritual warfare. Can she testify to what she saw? He asked Dr. Cross. I can translate, but Thomas, you know what this means. Once you file charges against railroad employees, there's no going back. Thomas looked at the young woman's injuries, then at the badge on his chest. Some decisions, he realized, made themselves. Jimmy, he called to his deputy. Prepare arrest. Warrants for Jake Morrison and 3 of his men. Charges are destruction of property, assault, and interfering with religious practices protected under federal treaty. Jimmy stared at him. Marshal, are you sure about this? The railroad company will discover that the law applies to everyone in my territory, Thomas said firmly. Rich or poor, white or Indian. As word spread through Pine Ridge that the marshal was arresting railroad men, Thomas knew he'd crossed a line from which there was no return. The gathering storm was about to break, and he could only hope he'd chosen the right side when the thunder finally rolled. The arrest of Jake Morrison and his men sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge that reached all the way to Denver. Thomas locked the 4 railroad mercenaries in his jail's only 2 cells, their protests and threats echoing through the stone walls. Morrison himself sat sullenly in the corner, his scarred face promising future violence. You have no idea what you've started, Marshal, Morrison growled. Mr. Wellington won't stand for this interference. Thomas ignored him, focusing instead on the growing crowd outside his office. Half the town seemed to be gathering, split between those supporting his decision and those fearing economic retaliation from the railroad. Company. Dr. Cross arrived with fresh medical supplies and a grim expression. Thomas, I've just treated 2 more Lakota who were beaten by railroad security. It's getting worse out there. Before Thomas could respond, the thundering of hooves announced the arrival of Marcus Wellington and a dozen additional hired guns. The railroad executive dismounted with theatrical fury, his expensive clothes dusty from hard riding. Marshal Garrett. Wellington's voice carried across the square. I demand you release my employees immediately. These false charges are a transparent attempt to obstruct legal development. Thomas stepped onto his porch, hand resting casually on his gun butt. Mr. Wellington, your employees are charged with assault and destruction of property. They'll have their day in court like anyone else. Court? Wellington laughed harshly. There won't be a court, Marshal. Governor Patterson has already received my telegram about your interference with federal development projects. Your replacement should arrive within the week. The crowd murmured nervously. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, but held his position. Until that happens, I'm still the law in Pine Ridge. Your men stay locked up. Wellington's eyes glittered dangerously. Very well. But understand, Marshal, you've chosen the losing side. When federal troops arrive tomorrow, they'll have orders to maintain order by any means necessary. Your Indian friends had better be prepared for the consequences. As Wellington and his men rode toward the surveyor camp, Jimmy approached with obvious concern. Marshal, what if he's right about the governor? What if they really are sending a replacement? Thomas considered the question while studying the faces in the crowd. He recognized the fear. These people had families to feed, businesses to protect. They couldn't afford to be caught in a war between the railroad and the Lakota. Jimmy, how long have you been wearing that badge? 2 years, you know that. And in those 2 years, what have you learned about the difference between law and justice? The young deputy thought carefully. That they're not always the same thing? That's right. Sometimes upholding the law means breaking it. Thomas turned to face his deputy fully. I'm asking you to make a choice, son. You can turn in your badge now, walk away clean, and no one will blame you. Or you can stand with me and accept whatever. Consequences come. Jimmy looked at the badge on his chest, then at the jail where the railroad men were being held. Marshal, those men beat a young woman for protecting her sacred sites. If we let that slide, what kind of lawmen are we? The unemployed kind, most likely, Thomas said with a grim smile. But I'm proud of you, Jimmy. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Running Bear and White Eagle, accompanied by Dr. Cross, who would serve as translator for the formal testimony they planned. Marshal, Running Bear said gravely, my scouts report the soldier Chief Harrison arrives with many blue coats. They make camp 5 miles from our village. Thomas nodded. He'd expected this development, but hoped for more time. Chief, we need to accelerate our documentation process. If we can present evidence of treaty violations to federal authorities before Harrison takes military action, you still believe in your government's justice? White Eagle asked skeptically. I believe in the power of truth when it's properly presented, Thomas replied. And I know there are still honorable men in Washington who honor treaties. They spent the next 2 hours taking formal statements and photographing evidence of the desecration. Dr. Cross proved invaluable as a translator and witness, her medical expertise lending credibility to their documentation of injuries. As evening approached, a new crisis emerged. Colonel Harrison himself rode into Pine Ridge with a small escort, his military bearing and stern expression commanding immediate attention from the gathered townspeople. Marshal Garrett, Harrison said, not bothering with pleasantries. By order of the territorial governor and federal authorities, you will release the railroad employees currently in your custody and cease all interference with authorized development activities. Thomas stepped forward, meeting the colonel's steely gaze. Colonel, those men are charged with serious crimes against persons and property. They're entitled to due process under territorial law. Territorial law is suspended in matters affecting federal development projects, Harrison replied coldly. You have 1 hour to comply, or I'll have my men break down your jail doors. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested for obstruction of federal directives and confined pending court-martial. Harrison's voice carried the finality of absolute authority. Your deputy as well, if he chooses to support your insubordination. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the confrontation between civil and military authority. Thomas could see the fear in their faces, but also something else, a growing awareness that this moment would define their community's character for generations to come. Dr. Cross stepped forward boldly. Colonel Harrison, as a witness to the crimes committed by those railroad employees, I protest their release. They beat innocent people and destroyed sacred sites in direct violation of federal treaties. Harrison barely glanced at her. Doctor, I suggest you concern yourself with medical matters and leave law enforcement to those qualified to handle it. And perhaps you should speak with someone qualified to handle treaty law, came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a man in a dusty black suit approaching on horseback. He dismounted with careful dignity, revealing himself to be perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and intelligent gray eyes. Judge Marcus Whitmore, Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, the newcomer announced, producing official credentials. I've been sent by the Justice Department to investigate reports of treaty violations and civil rights abuses in this territory. Wellington, who had returned with the colonel, went pale. Judge Whitmore, this is an unfortunate misunderstanding. The railroad company has always operated within legal parameters. Mr. Wellington, Judge Whitmore interrupted calmly, I have a telegram from Senator Miller's office detailing specific allegations of treaty violations and deliberate provocation of conflict. I'm here to determine the truth of those allegations. Thomas felt a surge of hope. The telegrams he'd sent to Senator Miller had apparently reached the right ears in Washington. Colonel, Harrison looked uncomfortable for the first time. Your Honor, my orders come directly from the War Department regarding maintenance of civil order. Colonel, my authority supersedes military directives in matters of federal treaty compliance, Judge Whitmore said firmly. Marshal Garrett, I understand you have evidence to present regarding alleged violations of the Fort Laramie Treaty? Thomas nodded, hardly daring to believe this turn of events. Yes, Your Honor. We have witness testimony, photographs, and medical documentation of systematic destruction of sacred sites and assault on tribal members. Then we'll convene a formal hearing tomorrow morning, the judge declared. Until that time, all parties will maintain current positions. The railroad employees remain in custody. Military forces will maintain their current distance from tribal lands, and survey activities are suspended pending investigation. As the various parties dispersed, Thomas realized that his gamble on truth and legal process might actually pay off. But he also knew that powerful interests didn't give up easily. The real battle was just beginning. Judge Whitmore established his temporary court in Pine Ridge's largest building, the church, transforming the sacred space into an arena where competing versions of truth would battle for legitimacy. Morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored light across the assembled crowd that included railroad executives, military officers, tribal representatives, and curious townspeople. Thomas sat at the front, his carefully prepared evidence folder thick with photographs and witness statements. Beside him, Dr. Cross served as translator for the Lakota witnesses, while Running Bear and White Eagle maintained stoic dignity despite the hostile stares from railroad supporters. Judge Whitmore called the proceedings to order with a gravity that silenced even the most restless spectators. This hearing will determine whether actions taken by the Colorado and Pacific Railroad Company constitute violations of federal treaties and civil rights protections. We will hear all testimony with respect for due process and human dignity. Wellington's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Crawford, who'd arrived on the morning train, rose first. Your Honor, the railroad company operates under full federal authorization. Any disruption of their activities represents interference with interstate commerce and national development priorities. Noted, Mr. Crawford. Marshal Garrett, present. Your evidence. Thomas stood, feeling the weight of history in the moment. Your Honor, I submit photographs of deliberate destruction of sacred sites protected under the Fort Laramie Treaty, medical evidence of assaults on tribal members, and testimony from multiple witnesses to these violations. He began with Star Maiden's testimony, translated carefully by Dr. Cross. The young woman described in heartbreaking detail how railroad security had destroyed the medicine wheel where her grandmother's spirit was believed to rest, laughing as they smashed stones that had been arranged in prayer for generations. They said our spirits were just rocks and dirt, Star Maiden testified, tears streaming down her face. They said we needed to learn that their God was stronger than ours. Crawford objected repeatedly, claiming hearsay and irrelevance, but Judge Whitmore allowed the testimony to continue. The photographs Thomas presented showed clear evidence of deliberate destruction: sacred objects smashed with sledgehammers, burial markers used as surveying points, prayer sites contaminated with refuse. When White Eagle took the stand, his English was careful but powerful. This valley holds 7 generations of our ancestors. When we die, our spirits join theirs in the sacred places. To destroy these sites is to murder our dead and leave their spirits homeless. Mr. White Eagle, Crawford cross-examined aggressively, isn't it true that your people have repeatedly threatened violence against railroad employees simply doing their jobs? White Eagle's eyes flashed dangerously. We have defended our sacred places as any man would defend his church or his family. Graves. If that is violence, then show me a people who would not fight for their dead. The railroad's defense centered on claims of legitimate development authority and allegations of tribal hostility. Wellington himself testified that his employees had acted only in self-defense against savage aggression, and that destruction of primitive rock piles was necessary for proper surveying. But Thomas had prepared for this line of defense. His next witness was Jake Morrison himself, called under subpoena despite his lawyer's objections. Mr. Morrison, Thomas questioned, you were hired specifically as security for surveyor operations, correct? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. That's right. Would you describe your previous experience in such positions? I've worked security for mining companies, cattle ranchers, various development projects. Thomas consulted his notes, including the Sand Creek operation in Colorado Territory. 2 years ago, the question hit like a thunderbolt. Sand Creek, where Colonel Chivington's militia had massacred over 100 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children, remained a source of national shame and scandal. Crawford objected vehemently, but Judge Whitmore overruled. The witness will answer regarding his qualifications and experience. Morrison's face flushed. I was hired to maintain security. What happened there wasn't my decision. But you participated in actions that resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians. It was a military operation. A military operation later condemned by Congress as a massacre of peaceful Indians under military protection. Thomas pressed. Would you say your hiring suggests the railroad company expected violent confrontation rather than peaceful development? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Wellington's face had gone ashen as the implications of hiring known Indian fighters became clear. Dr. Cross's medical testimony proved devastating to the railroad's case. She detailed injuries consistent with unprovoked attacks, documented the psychological trauma inflicted on assault victims, and presented evidence that several incidents had occurred on lands specifically protected under federal treaty. Dr. Cross, Judge Whitmore asked, in your professional opinion, were these injuries sustained in self-defense situations or aggressive assaults? Your Honor, the pattern of injuries, defensive wounds, trauma to fleeing victims, evidence of pursuit and deliberate brutality clearly indicates systematic aggression rather than defensive action. Late in the afternoon, Judge Whitmore made an unexpected request. I want to personally inspect the sites in question. All parties will accompany me to the Sacred Valley tomorrow morning for direct observation of the alleged destruction. That evening, Thomas met privately with Running Bear and White Eagle at the Lakota camp. The mood was tense. Warriors from 3 tribes had gathered, ready for war if the legal process failed. Tomorrow will decide everything, Running Bear said gravely. If your judge rules against us, my people will not accept confinement to the reservation. Too many have already died there from sickness and starvation. Thomas nodded, understanding. He'd seen the reservation conditions firsthand: overcrowding, inadequate food supplies, corrupt agents who sold treaty-guaranteed supplies for personal profit. It was a slow death sentence disguised as government policy. Chief, whatever happens, tomorrow, I want you to know something. Fighting beside your people for justice has been the most honor I've found in 15 years of wearing this badge. White Eagle studied Thomas intently. You speak truth, Marshal. But tomorrow, we discover if truth has power in the white man's world. As they prepared for what might be the final day of legal proceedings, Thomas reflected on how far he'd traveled. From the young lawman who'd blindly followed orders without questioning their justice. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper on the night wind, reminding him that some stands were worth taking regardless of their cost. The sacred valley would either vindicate their faith in legal justice or prove that only force could protect the innocent from powerful interests. Thomas prayed for the former while preparing for the latter. Dawn broke gray and cold as Judge Whitmore's inspection party assembled for the ride to the sacred valley. The procession resembled a strange parade. Federal officials, railroad executives, tribal representatives, and military escorts making their way across rolling prairie toward the heart of the dispute. Thomas rode beside Dr. Cross, both of them, acutely aware that this day would determine the fate of the Lakota people and the future of their territory. Behind them, Wellington and his legal team maintained tense silence, while Colonel Harrison's cavalry provided security with obvious reluctance for their unusual mission. Judge Whitmore, despite his 60 years, sat his horse with practiced ease. Marshal Garrett, he said, as they rode, in your 15 years of frontier service, how many treaty disputes have you witnessed? Too many, Your Honor. Most ended badly for the tribes, regardless of the legal merits of their cases. And why? Do you suppose that is? Thomas chose his words carefully. Because justice requires power to enforce it, and the tribes have learned that promises written on paper can be broken as easily as they're made. Running Bear and White Eagle led the way to Medicine Rock, their faces grim with the knowledge that sacred sites would be exposed to skeptical outsiders. The massive stone formation rose from the prairie like a natural cathedral, its red sandstone walls carved by wind and water into shapes that seemed almost deliberately spiritual. Your Honor, Running Bear explained through Dr. Cross's translation, this place has been sacred to our people for more generations than we can count. Our ancestors carved prayers into these stones, held ceremonies here to ensure the buffalo would return, came here to seek visions that would guide our people through difficult times. Judge Whitmore dismounted to examine the destruction more closely. What they found exceeded even Thomas's prepared expectations. Every prayer carving had been systematically defaced with chisels and hammers. Sacred geometric patterns carefully maintained for centuries had been obliterated. Ancient pictographs telling the story of tribal migrations had been scraped away completely. Mr. Wellington, Judge Whitmore said quietly, how do you explain this level of destruction? This appears far beyond what any legitimate survey would require. Wellington exchanged glances with his lawyer before answering. Your Honor, my employees were instructed to clear obstacles that might interfere with surveying equipment. If some decorative stonework was damaged, it was purely incidental to legitimate operations. White Eagle stepped forward, his voice shaking with controlled rage. Decorative stonework? These prayers have protected our people for 700 years. This is like burning down your churches and calling them decorative buildings. Group moved on to the burial grounds, where the evidence of desecration proved even more damning. Ancient burial mounds had been torn open, sacred objects scattered and broken, human remains left exposed to the elements. Even Colonel Harrison, a veteran of numerous Indian campaigns, appeared shaken by the systematic destruction. Sweet Jesus, the colonel muttered, dismounting to examine the violated graves. This isn't military action or development work. This is pure vandalism. Dr. Cross documented each site methodically, her medical training lending clinical precision to her observations. Your Honor, this level of destruction required significant time and effort. It couldn't have been accidental. or incidental to surveying. Activities. Judge Whitmore spent nearly an hour examining the evidence, asking detailed questions about tribal customs and the significance of each destroyed site. His questions revealed a deeper understanding of Indigenous cultures than Thomas had expected from a federal judge. "Chief Running Bear," Judge Whitmore said finally, "help me understand the full scope of what's been lost here. Not just the physical destruction, but the cultural impact." Running Bear spoke at length in Lakota, his voice heavy with grief, while Dr. Cross translated. "He says that destroying these sacred sites is like cutting the thread that connects past to future. Without these places where ancestors rest and spirits dwell, his people become culturally homeless. The prayers and ceremonies that maintain tribal identity cannot be performed properly elsewhere." Wellington's defense crumbled further when they discovered survey stakes, driven directly through ceremonial circles and prayer wheels. No legitimate surveying would require such precise placement on sacred objects. "Your Honor," Thomas interjected, "I'd like to call attention to the strategic nature of this destruction. Every major spiritual site in the valley has been targeted, but surveying requirements would only affect perhaps 20% of this area. Crawford attempted damage control. Your Honor, my clients maintain that all actions were taken in good faith pursuit of legitimate commercial development. Any cultural misunderstandings were unintentional." White Eagle translated this euphemism for the other tribal members, and their reaction was immediate and visceral. Several warriors reached for weapons before Running Bear gestured for restraint. "Tell your client," Judge Whitmore said coldly to Crawford, "that desecrating graves and destroying religious sites goes beyond cultural misunderstanding. This appears to be systematic elimination of tribal spiritual life designed to force removal through cultural destruction." The inspection revealed one final piece of evidence that sealed the railroad's fate. Hidden beneath survey equipment, Thomas discovered detailed maps showing not just the proposed rail line, but planned town sites, mining claims, and land divisions covering the entire Lakota Territory. "Mr. Wellington," Judge Whitmore said, studying the maps, "these documents suggest a comprehensive plan for territorial development far beyond a simple railroad corridor. Were you planning to inform federal authorities of these expanded intentions?" Wellington's silence spoke volumes. The maps revealed the true scope of the railroad company's ambitions: complete takeover of traditional Lakota lands through a combination of legal maneuvering and cultural destruction. As the inspection party prepared to return to Pine Ridge, Judge Whitmore pulled Thomas aside. "Marshal, this is one of the clearest cases of treaty violation and civil rights abuse I've encountered. Your documentation and investigation have been exemplary." "Thank you, Your Honor. What happens now?" "Now I return to Denver to file my report with the Justice Department. The railroad company will face federal prosecution for treaty violations, destruction of protected cultural sites, and conspiracy to defraud the government. The survey operations are permanently suspended." That evening, as word spread through Pine Ridge about the judge's preliminary findings, the mood in town began to shift. Businesses that had supported the railroad out of economic necessity started questioning whether such development was worth the moral cost. Dr. Cross found Thomas sitting on his office porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and gold. "You did it, Thomas. You actually did it." "We did it," he corrected, "all of us together. But I keep thinking about how close we came to disaster. If Judge Whitmore hadn't arrived when he did, but he did arrive. Sometimes the system actually works, even if it takes courage from good people to make it happen." Thomas nodded, but he knew their victory came with a price. Wellington and his surviving mercenaries had left town that afternoon, but not before, making threats about future retaliation. Colonel Harrison had withdrawn his troops, but military attitudes toward tribal resistance hadn't changed fundamentally. "The war isn't over," Thomas said quietly. This battle was won through legal means. But there will be other valleys, other sacred sites, other corporations that see Indian lands as obstacles to profit. Then we'll fight those battles when they come, Dr. Cross replied. But tonight, the Lakota people sleep in their ancestral valley, and their sacred sites are protected by federal law. That's worth celebrating. As if summoned by her words, the sound of tribal drums echoed across the prairie, victory songs carrying on the wind from the Lakota camp. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something approaching peace. 3 months later, Thomas stood in the same spot where he'd first learned about the railroad survey, watching autumn paint the Wyoming Territory in brilliant colors. The sacred valley remained untouched, protected now by federal injunction and military enforcement. But victory had come with unexpected costs that continued to shape his daily life. The territorial governor had indeed sent a replacement marshal, just as Wellington had threatened. However, Judge Whitmore's federal investigation had resulted in Thomas receiving a special appointment as federal marshal for Indian Territory affairs, with expanded authority to enforce treaty protections across the region. Jimmy Morrison had accepted appointment as Thomas's permanent deputy, having proven himself during the crisis. The young man had grown considerably, developing the kind of moral backbone that Thomas recognized as essential for frontier justice. Marshal, Jimmy said, approaching with the morning's correspondence, we've got 3 more reports of railroad companies testing tribal resolve in Colorado Territory. Looks like our victory here is inspiring other tribes to demand treaty enforcement. Thomas nodded, reviewing the reports. Word of their successful legal challenge had spread throughout Indian country, encouraging other tribes to resist illegal encroachment through proper channels rather than violent confrontation. Dr. Cross had become an unofficial liaison between tribal communities and federal authorities, her medical work providing natural cover for documenting treaty violations. Her detailed reports had already prevented 2 potential conflicts by forcing early federal intervention. The interesting thing, she observed, joining them on the porch, is how many white settlers are starting to support treaty enforcement. Once people saw the systematic destruction in the Sacred Valley, a lot of minds changed about what development really meant. It was true. The photographs and testimony from Judge Whitmore's investigation had been published in newspapers across the territory, creating public awareness of the difference between legitimate development and cultural destruction. Several frontier communities had passed resolutions supporting tribal treaty rights. Running Bear approached on horseback, his dignified bearing unchanged despite recent events. At 63, the chief had become something of a celebrity, invited to speak at churches and civic groups about Lakota culture and the importance of honoring agreements. Marshal Thomas, Running Bear said, dismounting with the careful grace of advancing age, I bring news from the Tribal Council. We have voted to establish a cultural preservation society, working with the Territorial Historical Commission to protect sacred sites throughout the region. Thomas smiled. That's excellent news, Chief. Legal protection is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. Yes, we have learned this lesson well. But I come also with a personal request. Running Bear's expression grew serious. The council wishes to adopt you officially into our tribe as my brother. It is a great honor, not given lightly. The offer touched Thomas deeply. In tribal culture, adoption represented complete acceptance and lifelong obligation to the community's welfare. It was recognition that his defense of Lakota interests had transcended mere professional duty. Chief, I'm honored beyond words. But you know accepting would mean my primary loyalty would always be to tribal welfare, even when it conflicts with federal directives. Yes, Running Bear said simply. That is why we offer it. A man who places justice above orders, honor above advancement. Such a man is needed as the bridge between our peoples. Thomas considered the implications. Accepting would essentially end any chance of advancement in federal law enforcement, marking him permanently as an advocate for Indian interests. But it would also formalize his role in protecting communities that had no other effective voice in the expanding American system. I accept with gratitude and awareness of the responsibilities involved. That evening, the adoption ceremony took place in the Sacred Valley, with representatives from multiple tribes witnessing the ritual. Thomas exchanged his federal badge for a medicine bundle, symbolically accepting that his authority now derived from moral obligation rather than government appointment. Dr. Cross served as witness, her presence representing the growing alliance between sympathetic whites and tribal communities. Jimmy Morrison attended as well, his own perspective on law enforcement forever changed by recent events. "Brother Thomas," Running Bear said as the ceremony concluded, "your path will not be easy. There will be many who see your loyalty to justice as betrayal of your own people. With respect, Chief, justice doesn't recognize racial boundaries. The Lakota are my people now, just as much as any white settlers seeking honest opportunity on the frontier." As they rode back toward Pine Ridge under starlight, Dr. Cross voiced the question Thomas had been pondering. "Do you ever regret the choice you made? You could have followed orders, kept your comfortable position, avoided all this complexity." Thomas thought of Sarah, of the young man he'd been when first pinning on a badge, of the compromise and moral flexibility that had seemed necessary for survival in frontier law enforcement. "Amanda, I spent 15 years trying to serve two masters, government policy and human decency. It took the Sacred Valley crisis to realize they weren't always compatible. Now I serve only one master, the principle that all people deserve justice under the law." The lights of Pine Ridge appeared ahead, warm and welcoming in the darkness. The town had changed since the railroad conflict, developing a stronger sense of community identity based on cooperation rather than exploitation. Marcus Wellington's railroad company had faced federal prosecution and massive financial penalties, effectively ending their operations in the territory. Other companies had taken note, approaching development projects with greater attention to treaty obligations and community concerns. Thomas knew the fundamental conflicts remained unresolved. The expanding United States would continue pressing westward, seeking resources and territory for a growing population. Indigenous communities would continue defending traditional lands and ways of life, essential to their survival. The difference now was that legal precedent existed for resolving such conflicts through justice rather than force. The Sacred Valley case had established that treaties carried real weight when properly enforced, that Indigenous rights had genuine protection under federal law. "You know what I find most remarkable about all this?" Jimmy said as they reached town. "How much stronger the community became when we started standing up for what was right instead of what was convenient." Thomas nodded. It was a lesson with implications far beyond their small frontier settlement. Justice, properly pursued, didn't weaken society. It strengthened the bonds that held communities together across cultural and racial lines. As he settled in for the night, Thomas felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found his true calling. The badge was different now, the authority derived from moral commitment rather than political appointment. But the essential work remained the same, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves and ensuring that power served justice rather than the reverse. The last frontier wasn't geographic territory to be conquered, but the moral territory where different peoples could coexist with mutual respect and shared commitment to human dignity. In the Sacred Valley of Wyoming Territory, that frontier had been successfully defended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts between competing visions of America's future. But tonight, justice had prevailed, honor had been preserved, and hope remained alive for a better way forward. ***. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the last frontier. If this story of courage and justice resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue bringing authentic Western tales to life.